Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Melissa Nahn, President and CEO of the American Composers Orchestra, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's professional development session, which is called Onstage Do's and Do's, Rehearsal Techniques, featuring Nina Shaker and Lina Gonzalez Granados. The music that you heard on the opening screen was an excerpt from Hush by Nina Shaker. Today's session is part of Earshot, the nation's first systemic program for building relationships between orchestras and composers. Through orchestral readings, collaboratory fellowships, consortium commissions, and professional development, Earshot expands the definition of American orchestral music to ensure a vibrant and inclusive future. Earshot is a program of the American Composers Orchestra, completed in partnership with the American Composers Forum, the League of American Orchestras, and New Music USA. Composers for our Earshot readings are selected through an open call process with no fee or age limit. We are delighted to welcome many of them here today. All of our Earshot professional development sessions are open to the public, and for the full schedule and list of topics, please visit us at www.americancomposers.org. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Garrett McQueen.
There we are. Hello, everyone. My name is not ACO host. My name is Garrett McQueen. I'm the Director of Artist Equity with the American Composers Orchestra. It's a pleasure for me to have you all here today for this very special professional development session. So getting an orchestra to read, to rehearse, and to perform your music as a composer, especially as an emerging composer, can be difficult enough on its own. But what happens when you finally get the opportunity to engage with an orchestra? Who should be your points of contact along the way? Are there procedures that composers should be aware of during the process that you may not be aware of without that heavy orchestral experience? These are just a few examples of the topics and the questions that I'll be exploring today with our featured speakers so that when your next opportunity to work with an orchestra comes, you'll be as prepared for the experience as you can be. I'm sure that you may have many questions or some comments that come to mind over the course of this presentation. So if you wouldn't mind offering those using the Q&A function here on Zoom as we go along, we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. If you're also tuning in on Facebook, feel free to use the comment section there as well if you'd like to chime in. And if you'd like to come on screen to ask your question at the end of today's presentation live and in the moment, feel free to use the hand raise function here on Zoom, and we'll bring as many of you on screen as we can as time allows. As a follow-up to this session, we will be offering materials, a few links for you to review, which will be available at a later date, so be sure to check back and stay tuned for those. I'll also be offering a survey in the chat at the conclusion of today's presentation, so if you wouldn't mind clicking that link when it appears and offering your feedback, it will be much appreciated. And with that, I'd like to introduce to you today's featured speakers. First up, we have Nina Shaker. Nina is a composer and multimedia artist who explores the intersection of identity, vulnerability, love, and laughter to create bold and intensely personal works. Described as tart and compelling by the New York Times, vivid by the Washington Post, and an orchestral supernova by the LA Times, her music has been featured by Carnegie Hall, Hollywood Bowl, Kennedy Center, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Walt Disney Concert Hall, the Library of Congress, National Gallery of Art, National Sawdust, I Care If You Listen, Score a Follower, and WNYC New Sounds of New York, as well as WFMT out of Chicago, and KUSC and KPFK rather, over on the West Coast. Aside from composing, Nina is a versatile performing artist as a flutist, a pianist, and a saxophonist. She has been featured by the National Flute Association, and she's performed in the Detroit International Jazz Festival and as a soloist with the USC Thornton Symphony and the Lublin Philharmonic at the Poland International Piano Festival. Please welcome Nina Shaker. Nina, welcome to the dialogue. Feel free to open your camera. Hello.
Hi, Garrett. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, a pleasure to have you along here. And I'd love to introduce our third person who everyone is going to be hearing from today. Praised for her rich, heartfelt orchestral sound by the Chicago Sun-Times, rhythmic vitality by the San Francisco Chronicle, and raw power by LA Times, Colombian American conductor Lina Gonzalez Granados has distinguished herself nationally and internationally as a singularly talented young conductor. Her powerful interpretations of the symphonic and operatic repertoire, as well as her dedication to highlighting new and unknown works by Latin American composers, have earned her international recognition. Most recently, as the recipient of the 2021 Sphinx Medal of Excellence, the third prize and Echo Special Award of La Maestra competition, as well as the 2020 and 2021 Schulte Foundation United States Career Assistance Award. Please welcome Maestro Lina Gonzalez Granados. Lina, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Hi, how are you? Can you see me? Yes.
Yep, can see you and hear you. Thanks so much for being here. Also,
Perfect.
I love your background as well. What are we seeing there?
This is Symphony Center in Chicago.
Oh wow, a space that I'm sure
It's
you know
been a
very
long
well.
time. It's been a long time since I don't do Zoom, so it's not from the times of the pandemic, apparently.
Well, we're glad for live performance to be in the space, and we're so happy to have the both of you in the space, offering some words and some guidance, being a part of this dialogue from both the composer perspective and the conductor perspective. So I think that we'll jump right in, and I'll start with you, Nina. When we think about the rehearsal process, you know, after the piece is written, after parts are printed, all of those things, when we think about the rehearsal process, what do you see as your role or the role of a composer in that space?
Yeah, it's interesting when in the writing process is such a slog, right? It takes a lot of work to write orchestral music, and not just from preparing the score, but also people who work as their own copyists, making parts is a real like a workload. And when we get to a rehearsal, I think that this is the area where it's sometimes less friendly for composers, because we spend all this time preparing music and we have very limited rehearsal time usually in normal orchestral settings. So I would say that usually in this at that stage, I think the composer's role is really a facilitator. I think they're there to answer questions. They're there to help the conductor also navigate this new score. But also they're there, as like a friendly face for the performers. I think that a lot of times orchestral musicians especially might be less familiar with performing music. Maybe certain techniques that composers might use in their pieces. This might be the first time they're playing stuff like that. And I just have noticed from my time working with orchestras that anytime a performer has a question, and even if it's during the break in the rehearsal and they come up to me and say, oh, what if I try this? Or what did you mean by this? Or did I sound okay even in my solo? I think they really appreciate that opportunity to get to know who the composer is and see a face. And hear what they're going for. And I think it's kind of a two-way street. It's like reassuring for the composer to hear feedback from the performers, but also for the performers to just know that they're doing okay on this new piece, that they haven't really gotten enough that much time, to rehearse the same way that they would have if it was like a Beethoven symphony, for instance.
Right, right. And we're definitely going to talk about the role of musicians. But Lena, this question of the role of the conductor in the rehearsal process can be very broad, certainly from an audience perspective and a musician perspective. But I wonder if you could speak to the role of a conductor specifically as it relates to the composer who may be in the room.
Yes, I think it's how do you say, complementary to what Nina is saying, which is that there is a sound world, there is a specific to a piece, and the conductor and the composers, when they are in the room together, are facilitators to to create the closest version to that sound world. Depending on the level of the orchestra, because some orchestras might do it easier or might need a little bit of time. So it's getting the concept of the piece, first of all, getting the concept of the piece and what is it about together, and then facilitating via rehearsal techniques the closest version from what it's written on the page, which is our own, like our raw material, and from maybe what is in the composer's mind. At the end, I do believe in this concept of being like a composer's advocate and conduit to the music. It will only be possible if the score is clear enough to do that. And then when that happens, when the magic happens of a score being clear enough, one's ability to really discover what is it about sound world, not about pitch or about technical things, but about the bigger framework of the piece, then is when the magic happens and things happen very fast in rehearsal.
Yeah, it's something, Nina, that a thread that I want to pull on, based on what Lena just shared, was this idea of the score being clear enough. I think all composers have ideas, and maybe one of the challenges is to make sure that those ideas translate to people who actually have to manifest. When you hear Lena talk about the necessity of the score being clear enough, I wonder what comes to mind for you.
Oh, definitely. I think that with orchestral music in general, although I would say this is true of any score, I think being clear in your intentions and any kind of performance indications, any kind of specific notation that you're using, I think is really essential, but even more essential in orchestral context when rehearsal time is quite limited. And I think like ways of achieving clarity could be just even being very specific instead of like having a huge performance notes page. Even just writing those indications directly in the score, I think, is a big help for performers, so they don't have to consult this separate index, you know, of all of your symbols that you're using. Even things like just making sure your score, like the notation is clear in terms of like notes overlapping, just basic things like that makes a huge difference. But also, I think that it's important to note that this doesn't mean that your music has to be simplified in any way, or that your music has to be like the language you're using has to change. I think that I've seen some really effective orchestral pieces that involved some techniques that maybe aren't traditional notation, like things like some aleatory boxed notation, even some graphic scores, and it was still very effective. But I think it worked because they were very clear about their intentions, very clear about what every symbol they were using meant, and they communicated in a way where it was directly in the score, directly in the part, as simple as possible for the conductor and the orchestral musicians to follow. So I think that's an important thing to note, because a lot of composers will feel like they have to change their, you know, musical vocabulary because of like the context that they're in, but that's not necessarily true.
Yeah, Lena, I wonder if you have engaged that challenge. We hate to put the composer in a box, so to speak, but at the end of the day, there are certain languages and certain techniques that orchestral musicians are more aware of. They may prefer to see a small P if they have to play softly, as opposed to what a composer, you know, may put forward otherwise. So I wonder if you could speak to sort of being the middle person, maybe even the translator between what a composer puts forward and what musicians, based on their training, are able to understand and to manifest.
I think everything comes down to, at least in a personal side, for me, when I engage with a catalog, a specific catalog, or a specific composer, is about trust. And for me, trust comes from the fact that all the information that they want is already out there. There is no like, I don't know if this actually makes sense with the question that you're asking me, but if you want me to be a little more clear, please let me know. It's just, if all of the information is there for people to see and to practice, 99% of the time, musicians will own it before rehearsal, and rehearsal will just be to put things in context to each other. It's not to learn how to do a specific technique on the spot. They have to be already ready, but that only comes if all the information is there. For example, if a specific score, I'm talking about not standard techniques, but for example, something that is poorly edited with a lot of misprints. You know, that it's all about, like, it's pitch related. Let's talk about something as basic as pitch, and then we can talk about standard techniques. Pitch related, but you hear a lot of misprints and things that maybe are not that are not language related, but are actually bad editions. People start losing trust in rehearsal, and that's when problems start happening. So when everything, and I say this because one of the things, and this is not like a something to be and a space to praise people, but Nina is especially very neat and very trustworthy in everything that she puts on the score. Like, I've never have to doubt anything that she writes, and that's why I love taking her pieces on tour, like anywhere. Um, because it's just me being able to translate things. Now, with extended techniques, people just want to know the information on how to play it. If they know how, like what, how, when, then my job is not gonna be that. My job is gonna be the why. And when the why is there, then the process gets much easier.
Yeah, I
Does it
like
make
that.
sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And Nina, I saw you shaking your head as soon as Lena spoke to the when, where, and why. That it sounds like that's something that you think about in your process.
Yeah, I think especially you know, it's so interesting because I would also just make a point to say orchestras in different parts of the world also are very different in the kinds of repertoire they perform and even the kinds of techniques that they're comfortable with. I would say a lot of European orchestras, who the ones, I mean, there's a big range of European orchestras too, but I would say the ones that do more new music are quite comfortable with many different kinds of extended techniques that maybe certain American orchestras might be less comfortable with. And I think what's interesting is figuring out ways to communicate any kind of language that you're using to the players. So I've seen a lot of people who do use a lot of extended techniques in their music. What they'll do is they'll put a QR code directly in the part. This is
I love
becoming
that.
more and more, yeah, it's becoming more and more popular, and people can scan it with their phone. They can see a video of the technique being demonstrated. Even just putting a web link could be helpful if you can't figure out how to make a QR code, although that you can actually just Google there's a QR code builder online. But that's been really helpful for, I've heard from orchestral musicians who are having to learn a new technique that they've never done before. So it's just kind of more about communicating, finding a way to clearly communicate to the performers, either if it's through a video, if it's through words, like a word indication, but just being as effective in your communication as possible.
Yeah, that's a really good tip. The QR
That is
code. I
key.
don't know if I would have thought of that. We'll be sure to offer that in the post webinar resources. So Nina, I'm going to stick with you. You've had at this point in your career many first readings or first rehearsals of your works and throughout your collaborations. I wonder if you can think back to the very first time you had an orchestra read one of your works and you were a part of the rehearsal process, and how that very first time differs from your approach now. If you were to have a rehearsal later today, are there significant things that you've learned over the course of your career so far that you can share with the people here?
Oh, definitely. First, I just want to say I'm so humbled by what Lena said, because I still really feel like I really feel like a young composer, and I'm always learning, and I'm always like rethinking the way I communicate, in my scores. So I really appreciate that, Lena. But yeah, so my first professional orchestral experience was actually on Zoom. It was during the pandemic. And so it was obviously quite different for those reasons. In some senses, it was easier because I could just communicate through notes. I just texted my notes to the conductor, and then they would say it in rehearsal. But I will say, I think I've gotten a lot braver, I think, in rehearsal settings than I had been in the past, and that's something that really, it took enough experiences, also just being in the room, and kind of working with different conductors who have very different styles of leading a rehearsal. And I think, in music school, a lot of times the way that we're taught to work with orchestras and to communicate to conductors is very it's very formal. It's very scary, honestly, the way that they tell us. They say, oh, you can only have 3 things you're going to say in your rehearsal. You must go through the conductor. You cannot communicate directly to the players, all these rules like that, which, depending on the conductor, it might be effective to do that. But I will say, you know, my first professional, like really big professional experience, honestly, was with New York Phil. And I was like very nervous during the rehearsal. And I remember the first rehearsal, they had me sit in the back of the hall because the sound is better. But it was really hard for me to give comments and like having to yell. I was also having to wear a mask because it was during the pandemic. And I kind of learned very quickly, oh, I don't think this is the way I should like participate in this rehearsal. And then I realized what I needed to do was actually like arrange for a time for me to meet with the conductor, who was Yop in this case. And we met during the break. I gave my few comments, and it was way more effective. And then I ended up sitting in the front of the rehearsal so I could just come up quickly and give comments. In some cases I've requested a microphone because, I'm a small brown girl. Like, it's not a lot of these rules that we're told in in music school really don't work for me. I'm not able to yell that loudly. I don't take up a lot of space the way that they tell conductors to or composers to operate in these settings. So I had to really figure out the system that worked best for me. And then I realized that I was still able to communicate everything I wanted. I had performers in these orchestras that would come up to me during the break and ask questions, and they felt comfortable doing that. So I considered that a success in terms of how I was communicating with everybody. But it definitely took a few of those experiences for me to feel like I really understand that I don't have to do what I was taught, in music school. Like I can figure out my own system of communicating that works for me.
And Lena, I definitely want to get your perspective on the rules as Nina referred to them there. But something that I think is so powerful and so important is the actual human interaction. There may be composers, prior to that first reading who might feel shy about reaching out the conductor or may not know what the procedure is there. From your perspective, I wonder how initial conversations happen between conductor and composer and how you facilitated that in your experience.
Well, that's a very interesting question, because I mean, I think it's I have been in different instances as a conductor that I want to share. Some as an assistant conductor of very big houses or very big orchestras with great personalities and big personalities of conductors and composers. And the second, like being my own person, my own agent, and establishing my own relationships. And I think the ones that I've seen more effective are more successful are the ones that are rooted in boundaries first. So for me, how do I establish a boundary? Like even as an assistant conductor or like in as a conductor, I always ask what is expected of me, or how can I be most helpful during the process and during the time. So for example, I like when composers say like, what do you need from me? Or I say the same as like as a conductor, for example, if I approach Nina, it's like, as I know that, for example, Nina, her scores don't have mistakes, or I don't approach them by looking with a like how do I say it, like a magnifying glass for the mistake that I think it is. But I just look about the sound, or I want her to give me all her ideas, and then I'll bounce my ideas back. So I just want her to give me everything and feed me with information. And then I tell her, well, or Nina is like, this is the amount of time that we're going to allocate for the piece. If it's, for example, or X person, this is the amount of time that we have allocated for the piece. I need some information. If I need some information, I'm going to reach out to you. If not, we'll meet at the break. If we find that the piece is moving swiftly, we'll meet at the break. Or if the piece, so I try to give them the space to know that sometimes I might open the possibility to do it directly or not. When I've seen, for example, composers that when they say, is there anything that you want for me, and they start talking to the orchestra, some conductors really don't like that. Some conductors really want the like, and I've seen, I've seen this clash a lot, and then I'm like, wow. So that's why I always start with telling people what I want to do with my time, with or what I want to do, so people know exactly what can they expect of me. And then after that, I'm always open to feedback. I'm interested in balance feedback, in tempo feedback, the things that I can do with my hands easily. And if there is anything that it's necessarily that needs to be changed necessarily and can be do it on the spot, I want to know. For example, this really needs to change the dynamic because it doesn't work. And for those, I do pick. I mean, if they give me a list of 20 things that they can change, that I need to change, I don't have the time for the second rehearsal. I just use my opinion, my professional opinion, and then I filter back and send it to the say it in the orchestra before we start again a run or something. And then I choose 3 or 4, because then when we start saying 20 things to the orchestra, my people might lose concentration, but I just want composers to give me all the information during rehearsal, at least and then I can make decisions. But it's all about the boundary, like if a composer, like if I say like, what are you thinking of the sound world, like what were you thinking, and they don't give me anything, then it's gonna be only me, and it's very boring to be in that position, because I've been already with the score for so long. I just, what you said, I want to establish a human connection. I want to know who's behind the paper.
Yeah. And when we talk about those boundaries, Lena, one of the biggest boundaries seems to be the boundary between composer and musician throughout the rehearsal process. I know that every conductor is different, every orchestra is different, but generally speaking, what would you say about composer to musician interaction? Should that happen during the rehearsal? Is it okay for that to happen at break? I wonder what your ideas are there.
It depends. It depends of the musician. I think it depends of the orchestra musician more than and the intrinsic culture. Some orchestras, and I mean, this you just learn by doing, and by establishing maybe a later a relationship that is more lasting, instead of a first reading on a one time only thing. I would say that if it's just a first approach, let's see if you can, if they approach you and use the conductor as the conduit for those conversations to happen. If, for example, during rehearsal, an orchestra musician approaches the composer and is like, hey, can I ask someone to the composer? I always like step back and allow that conversation to happen, because it's directly, it doesn't concern me. But in general, I would say use your tools, use the conductor, use your other people in the process. For example, with big orchestras who have assistant conductors, those are also a very big ally into letting someone have an information on the micro. The assistant conductors are there also to let those same priorities known to a conductor as well. Balance and not pitch, but maybe balance and timings and things that you cannot hear on the podium, that are already out or might not even be heard for acoustics. So it's like, try to use all the people around you, and also create those relationships with them, and make yourself useful to the team, and the team will value you in that sense.
Yeah, Nina, I wonder how you engage that question, because I'm sure there have been rehearsals where and I won't say an instrument name to to keep things neutral, but the principal, whoever, raises their hand and says, Nina, this part is such, or how do you want X, Y, and Z? What have been your experiences with that direct composer to musician dialogue, especially on stage in the moment?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, usually when I have the direct like conversation to performer, it's usually during a break. But during rehearsal time, I think what I've noticed, what happens is usually the conductor will kind of like divert to the player and say, okay, you talk now. And then the player will ask a question. And then like I think the best example I can think of is there was like a rest missing in one part or something. And then that person asked, oh, is there a rest here? And then I answered right then. So in that sense, I think those kinds of things, usually the player, or if it's a specific technique or something like that. Although even then, I will say usually most performers will ask during the break, I think, because they're also mindful of how much time is limited. Um, but I will say, I think things like balance, stuff like that, if I have general comments like that, I do find it more effective for me to go through the conductor usually, because they know how to communicate with the orchestra, um, especially if it's like, somebody who has a long-standing relationship with the orchestra also, like they know how to really connect with the players and communicate in the way that's most effective to them. But even in general, I think, you know, conductors are naturally taught how to project their voice, how to like that's like a big part of their job. So I think it makes sense in that context for me to, if it's like forte, make this part forte, like for me to just tell Lena or whoever is the conductor, and then they relay that onto the performers, rather than me telling bassoon play forte, and then I'm just like talking to them directly.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
And there's also one thing that sometimes happens is that there are musical solution to technical problems happening on the whole that might solve a problem easily instead of saying forte. Sometimes forte or piano are problems of color or problems of like of getting someone else, in the balancing other things on the podium, from the podium. So if you say, I can't hear this instrument, or this instrument is too forward, then you can find other solutions to the same problem, and approach it in a different artistic manner. And orchestras also I appreciate that.
And when we talk about these sorts of levels of communication, Nina, I'm sure that there are times when you hear something played that you wish maybe were a little different, not from the musician necessarily, but from yourself. Maybe you wish you had written it different. I wonder if you could speak to your experiences creating errata, making edits or corrections live in the moment.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, every time I get so nervous if there's a mistake. I've been lucky, knock on wood, that there hasn't been any like major catastrophe with my scores. But definitely in terms of errata and things like that, I mean, the librarian is your best friend. I think especially if you're lucky to have repeat performances of a piece, from one performance you will gather some errata, and then the next performance you can relay that onto the library and they can correct it ahead of time. But in the moment when that happens, I think it's just you have to be humble and say, be as quick as communicating as possible. So whether that means you have to be like very decisive in the moment, you have to say, okay, just just put the rest there. If there's something that's a major problem, um, you have to kind of be quick on your feet and find the fastest solution for that. And I also just wanted to piggyback on something Lena was saying about you know, other kinds of solutions that could, help things like with balance and stuff like
Mm,
that. That I, this is something that actually usually the assistant conductor has always been very helpful. I think it's really great for composers to develop a relationship with whoever the assistant conductor is, because they are used to hearing the orchestra, and they also really put in the time in understanding your score, which is really special. And they can hear things in balance that, in the moment it's really easy to be overwhelmed with like all these things going on, and they can just sit back and take notes. So but also I was just going to say is like, if you're lucky to have more than one rehearsal and over the course of a few days, like use that time in between rehearsals to take notes. And that's when you can think about things like, oh, maybe it's too loud here because all these people are playing long tones that are covering up the melody, and that those people should be softer, rather than just saying louder, louder or something. So, and but that you can, if you have that time, like put in that work in between rehearsals, and because conductors do that all the time. So like it's our piece, so we should do that too. So I think that that's a really great way to be able to find solutions like that.
I definitely want to circle back to the conversation about the librarian being your friend as the composer. But, Nina, again, I'm thinking about changes in the moment that may not necessarily be errors, but maybe you just want to do something different in the moment. You find that inspiration. I wonder how you carve out those barriers for yourself, because we could compose and recompose constantly, or we can give the musicians the room to actually have something solid to bring forward. How do you decide what's worth a mention in the errata, or what's worth a change once the rehearsal process has started?
Yeah, I the best example I can think of this is in one of my pieces there was a flute solo, and actually this is one of the pieces that Lena has conducted, Lumina, where there were some pitch bends in the flute solo. And I remember in one of the orchestras that has done the piece, the flutist came up to me afterwards and was like, what if I don't play this like with my, if you take off the it's just the head joint, you can really easily do like all kinds of kooky pitch bends. And he asked like, what happens if I do that? And in the moment, I mean, I'm a flutist myself, so I'm familiar with that. And in the moment I was like, you know what, sure. And I think it takes us also realizing that music is about connection, and it should inspire everyone. And if it inspired a player to think of a totally different way of approaching the piece that I feel comfortable with, then so be it. And so I think that a lot of times I've been really amazed, with either different conductors or different performers who have found all these different nuances in my piece, different ways of approaching it, and that I might not have otherwise considered. So I think I'm usually open to that when somebody, figures out a different way to approach something. But of course, if you're not comfortable, let's say I didn't like the way that the flutist was rethinking the solo, then I'm allowed to say like, oh, I think actually just do it the normal way, which I think it's just a balance of feeling what excites you also and feels in the same sound world, um, just finding that balance.
Yeah, and Lena, I wonder from the conductor perspective if you have ideas around the limitations on what can be changed once the rehearsal process begins. I think ultimately it's a very hoped for, at least from the musicians, to know exactly what they're going to play, for there to be no changes. But even if the composer wants there to be some creative changes, again, not necessarily errors, from your perspective, is there room for that once the rehearsal process begins?
Yes, I think there is room, and there should be room, but it all depends of the time. And I would say it's there is a certain point that it's for me it's a parallel of relationship between, for example, a director in opera, someone directing, and then the final dress, and then runs. Like for me, the final dress has to be ready. At least for the time being. What does that mean? That mean that is that the piece is never the piece doesn't have an end. Like I think Nina or whoever is in charge is allowed to make changes after, but at least you want to give. For me, my rule is that in dress rehearsal, people want to feel as safe as possible. And safe means that the process is done and that we are ready to put it forward. And yeah, and also performances always change, but you cannot change it in or bend so much that people really don't feel that they're ready. And again, I come back to the same word, which is trust. And trust is built upon the fact that they want to be reassured that the piece works.
Hmm.
So for me, at least for the time, and then sometimes I go to first, second, third performance on a week, on a subscription week, and I have notes. And then after the third performance, and I'm in my flight back home, I still have notes for the next time that I do it, and I do it differently. So the piece is not the end of the piece when the piece is performed, but at least for the orchestra's sake, I would say my limit would be dress rehearsal.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair. As promised, I do want to make sure that we return to the conversation of the librarians. Before we do that, I'll just encourage everyone, if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A feature, the chat, and if you want to ask your question live, use the hand raise feature and keep that hand raised, and I'll bring you to the screen to ask your question live in the moment. But Nina, back to the orchestra librarians. You described the orchestra librarian as a composer's best friend. I wonder if you could speak more to that, the role of the librarian in this process.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, librarians have definitely like saved my soul on a number of occasions. Yeah, they just are really attentive. And even before, if it's a premiere of a piece, they will look through your score and find, hey, I think there's a mistake here. And I had one piece that I was very rushed on, and it was kind of a miracle I sent it on time. And there were some mistakes in the score, and the librarians were able to catch that before the first rehearsal, and then I could like fix things in the score. I had that time because the librarians were very attentive. And I think in general, they are the ones who will figure out basic things of like, oh, there's something that is even like a really dramatic issue of like, oh, something is not transposed correctly or something. Like they can catch that, and they can help in that moment of like, okay, we can quickly print out a new set of parts. They can, things like that, even just like really dire situations, like they can help. And I think that establishing a good relationship with librarians as you navigate orchestra rentals, things like that, is always really important. I was lucky that several pieces of mine have been in circulation, and librarians will even send your parts back to the next orchestra, so I don't even have to worry about it, which I think is just really wonderful. So I think librarians deserve way more credit than they are given. They really are like hold the orchestra together.
Yeah, I'll agree with you there. I wonder if they're.
And
I'll go ahead,
they
please.
are, sorry that I interrupt you. They're not only the composer's best friend, but they're the conductor's best partners in crime. Like, because again, we're talking about they are the first people that are in contact with score and parts. So they are the first one who are really like in touch of the entire process, and they're like the middle person. They're not the middle person, they're like the most important person in our
Mhm.
orchestra. And for me, for example, especially with new pieces that are not by a composer that are alive, and that they have, like recovering voices of people that deserve to be on the stage, but they haven't been, unfortunately. Though I've been having this amazing relationship with some of the librarians, just because they really are. They put I want to say they put like a restraint on you in a lot of
Mhm.
ways. They really are trying to respect what's written on the score, instead of you just changing things because you really think this is a mistake or this is a misprint. So they're the first ones who are actually, the biggest composer advocate and conductors.
Yeah, thank you for that. What I was going to ask Nina, in addition to the orchestra librarian, in your experience, who have been other really important points of contact along the way? It's not typically the conductor or maybe even the librarian who sends the first email, as the process begins. I wonder if you can speak to other very important figures in the process.
Definitely. I mean, I mentioned earlier, like the assistant conductor is always a great, especially in rehearsal settings. They can catch a lot of things that I might not have the time to catch, or like I'm distracted because I have to answer other questions. I would also say, just from a more uh like a professional standpoint, like the artistic advisor is always like they're like the composer's advocate. They're the ones who choose who to program a lot of times, if it's not in cases where it's not like a conductor choosing, like they're people who are planning seasons and stuff like that. And they're also just really amazing in advocating for you know different voices that haven't been heard, who deserve to be heard all this time. Also, even things of like, let's say I decide I want to explore like a totally different sound world and things I haven't done before. Like they are really encouraging of that. And I think, for me, I've been really lucky in the orchestras that I've worked with and I've established like these longer term relations with. I think it's mainly through like the artistic advisor who like appreciated the sound worlds that I was developing and might have asked me then to work with them again, for another piece, which I think for young composers wanting to have more orchestral experiences, I think, getting to know these people who are kind of in charge of programming is like kind of the way in.
Yep. I want to turn to the chat. There's a very interesting question from Dora. Dora asks, are there ever differences in opinion between composer and conductor, and how are those resolved? Does one party take trump? Maybe I'll let Nina start with that question.
Oh, definitely. It's so funny because, certain pieces of mine that have been done by different people, like people will interpret things in such a different way. But I will say there was one situation where the opening of my piece, Lumina, opens with this vibraphone with a motor on. And I had one conductor decide they didn't like that and then said like I had like no vibrato in the strings but with the motor on and the vibraphone was my original indication, and they were like, no, I think we should have no vibration in the vibraphone but with vibrato in the strings. And then I told them, I said, I don't know if I like this, and I was very courteous. I think I let them try it in the rehearsal. And then I was lucky that we had multiple rehearsals. And then I said, I think for the next one, we won't do that. And they were understanding. And, at the end of the day, it is my piece, and it's my sound world that I'm developing. And even though it's a collaborative experience between the composer and the conductor, I don't think a composer, this is one of those instances where I felt braver over time to kind of speak up, and say, I don't like that. I think I actually would prefer just doing what I originally had. And I think it's just kind of approaching that with a courtesy, but also, I think everybody has to just drop the ego at the door when you're coming to a rehearsal, both from the composer side and the conductor and the performer side.
What do you think about that, Lena? Maybe differences of opinion between conductor and composer?
Totally. No, I think I agree. I agree completely with Nina. For me, my job and my role as a conductor is to make the composer shine in its best way about their version, and not about their version, but about their sound world and about their mission or purpose on that piece. I think when people are, I have found different. I think courtesy is the best antidote for this, because when I have had so I have had like this composer which I already like I was doing my first recording of this piece that I was not commissioning, but I was putting like all my money into the recording, and this guy just after like the whole after like doing all these meetings trying to get into his sound world, that he says, no, we need to change everything in the middle of the recording. I was just like, no, this is not gonna happen like that. And then we ended up we with something that we both didn't like. So I think it's just again putting all the cards on the table clearly, like that courtesy with the truth in hand, as fast as possible, as fast as possible in the process is what will make the thing easier. And I think that like something that Nina says, like there is so many conductors with so many opinions, same as there's many orchestras with different challenges and different talents, not like different levels of talent. Not all of them are gonna sound the same. So dropping the ego, yes, and knowing that the expectations might be different, so you have to really be able to to have an open mind to that first rehearsal and see what the possibilities are, because sometimes not all of the realities will be realized, but that doesn't mean that they don't deserve to play the piece. The opposite,
Hmm.
it's just one part of the process.
Yep. Well, before we run out of time, I definitely wanted to touch on what happens after the rehearsal process and even after the performance or performances of the work. I'll start with you, Nina. When it comes to having positive interactions during the process and maybe maintaining positive relationships after the fact, is there value in that? Is it important to stay in contact with conductors who you've collaborated with in the past?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, if it's somebody I really enjoyed working with, like Lena or, some other orchestras who I've worked with or conductors I've worked with, I'll always send them a note, like a thank you note. I'll always make sure if I'm not there at the performance, I'll always be sure to listen to the recording that I get, even if it's just an archival recording. um I that also extends to other admin people, like
Mm.
if it was there was one orchestra that was just like incredible in the way that they just handled logistics and that they organized my stay, and I was like so just honored that I was so used to like things being kind of like disorganized, and this orchestra was just like so organized, and I made sure to thank all the admins because I was just really moved by that. So I think it's definitely important to extend like some sort of communication after a concert, and I think that that's also for composers looking to hope get repeat performances or things like getting another commission, things like, Lena taking my piece on tour and feeling comfortable to perform the piece in other with other orchestras. That's because, you know, taking that time to really extend like a thoughtful communication with them afterwards is part of that. It makes them feel like, oh, that they did a good job too, and that I recognize it.
Yeah, and Lena, I know that the life of a conductor, certainly for you, has to be very busy. You know, after a performance, you're headed to another location. Maybe you have a completely different set of scores to learn. On the topic of maintaining those relationships, I wonder what best practices are from your perspective. What is the best way for a composer to maintain a relationship with you following a rehearsal process and performance?
Um, I always think that gratitude is important, and and not fake gratitude, but like real gratitude, in which you say thank you. Let's talk about more pieces. I like the piece, or I like working with you. If you really meant it. Um, and for me, when you get so busy, you relied in other people's experiences and word of mouth of
Hmm.
not only are the pieces good, but is this person easy to work with? Is this person, are they scores, clear enough? A lot of them is like, are they good with their deadlines? All of these things that other people that I don't have to deal with, but for example, librarians, like all of these things, all of those conversations always somehow permeate, because this is a human experience, rather than I mean, we always think about this craft as, very transactional, but the transaction is completely human. And for me, it's like I relied on people that I trust to recommend me composers, and then and then those are the ones that I'm gonna want to work with.
Great, great. Thank you for that. Well, Nina, I have one more question for you, but before I pose that, I want everyone here to know that I've just put a link to a survey in the chat. So if you would please click that link and let us know how you enjoyed this webinar, this dialogue. It will help us reframe the way that we move forward in our professional development webinar series. But Nina, my final question for you. I speak with composers oftentimes who want to really create something that's without strict parameter, without strict refinement, something that's really free. And unfortunately, there are many composers who see writing for orchestras as very limiting and very constricting in that way. I wonder if you can maybe sell the idea of writing for orchestra or speak to the benefits you've seen in using the orchestra as a medium for your own creations.
Oh, definitely. There's something really just beautiful about having 100 people on stage doing something together. And I think that that's just an inspiring thing for a composer to see and like to make happen. So I see a lot of value in writing for orchestra because of that, just as a community. It's so often, and right now as we're in the social climate, we're talking so much about community structures and how we can build community, and like an orchestra is that. Ultimately. I also would say, it doesn't have to be a limiting thing. You can communicate your ideas. You might have to maybe change some things in terms of notation and things like that, but it doesn't mean you have to actually change the heart of what you're trying to do. And I've seen some really effective pieces. I mean, I might even just mention it here. There's a piece called Tupaya that by a friend of mine named Selena Fisher, which is all like box notation, and it's very effective with orchestras, and they're able to perform it very quickly, and in the rehearsal process, which is incredible. And there's some other composers who have done similar things like this. I think nowadays a lot more composers are exploring these different kinds of notations, but before, people were so afraid to bring them into orchestra because we were like, oh, we only have 10 minutes of rehearsal time. I can't do anything too complicated. But that's not really true. Like, you can do things as long as you're communicating it in a way that is effective, and you're creating a world, also just a rehearsal world where everybody feels comfortable. The performers feel comfortable trying something new. I think the composers who have seen work in that kind of medium most effectively are the ones who build that really inclusive just dynamic in the rehearsal too. So yeah, I just always have felt really inspired writing for orchestra, just because it's like a huge color palette. It's like I'm an artist and I can choose as many colors as I want, which I might not otherwise be able to do. So I think it's just really an honor, and I get to develop relationships with so many people, in that medium. So I'm always inspired writing for orchestra.
I'd call that a pretty good pitch. Thank you for that. There actually is one question from the audience. I would like to invite Werner. If you're comfortable opening your camera and your microphone, please ask your question.
Hi. Yeah. It's my question is like more related to genre, because like contemporary music is a little bit different. With my experience writing for the orchestra, musicians they from the orchestra, they tend to ask me like like they had a hard time sometimes following the piece because there's no distinct like classical melody. So like, because they're so used to playing classical music 90% of the time, when they do a new piece, um, it's um, it's hard for them psychologically like to follow, unless like you put in a lot of cue notes. That helps a lot. But like to them, it's very mind draining. Like it's because they don't do this every day, right? So like to ask like in general, like how does the conductor and the composer like help the musicians, to really um like get into the music, especially some of them may not be so interested in new music, maybe, like how do you get the whole project going that like more efficiently, like they know what they're playing, they're not going to be lost mentally.
I don't know. Do you want to answer that, Nina, first? Or
Um, sure. Yeah, I think that it's interesting. Some pieces of mine that were maybe more tricky for players to grasp, things that were maybe more adventurous in rhythm or tonality, things that used other kinds of notation. Um, I think that definitely the conductor, I will say in my experience, really sets the tone of the rehearsal. So, in my experience, I mean, I've had mixed experiences like that. I've had things where if a conductor didn't set a positive tone and really like, let's try this together, then it was kind of like that. Everybody kind of drained their energy. But in cases where the conductor really did send a positive tone, and the composer too, if I'm there, like I've noticed that that makes a big difference in just people's open-mindedness to trying new things. So I think it's even less about just the music in general and just more about the rehearsal atmosphere.
I agree. This is where the how is so important. The how to rehearse is very important, and how to organize the piece in a way that people know where to grab on, and not everything has to have a melody. Now, that being said, I think aesthetics and taste are very varied in general, and what I find extraordinarily appealing and inspiring might not be the same that another person in another city with I don't know, a certain age might not like. And I think professional musicians that know how the business works know that the job is to play the piece, and not, and I'm not saying not to like it, but the job above else is to serve the composer. If and you have to live with that some people just might like it or not, so it's about how and the why, and show them. I think people get very interested to see if you have something to say, the why. I always go to that. Is there anything of depth, or it's just a piece that passes through? So it's all about rehearsal process. How do, and some conductors just don't like to do this work. I'm not it's a matter of taste in general, in that sense.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that response. I know that we're a little over time, but there's one more question
It's okay, of course.
from the audience that I would love to share. Giuseppe asked, I know this webinar is called Do's and Do's, but would you give us an example of an absolute don't? What not to do during the rehearsal process? I'll start with you there, Lena.
I would say disrespect anyone, like in general. If um, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. For example, I told you, I'm very clear to what I need from people. When that is not met, and it's made in a rude manner, then it's a not, like a yell, like someone yelling when we're playing. That is a definitely note. Disrespecting a librarian and telling them to do like a errata list that you should have done, you know, uh, bringing the scores already. It's a definitely not, like having like, and then not meeting your deadlines.
Hmm.
I would say. So those are like those are just a sign of disrespect for the process, which is orchestras are super overworked. They are underpaid. Like these people, I'm not saying conductors, but like people in the administrators are always looking forward, not looking for the week. So when we come, we need to facilitate their work again. And if we don't do that, then is for me is catastrophic in that sense.
Yeah, thank you for that, and I will certainly underscore the be on time with the deliverables. That is very important. Nina, any absolute don'ts from you?
I would just echo what Lena's saying. I think, be kind. I can't imagine. I'm trying to imagine a situation where someone would be like outright rude, but I mean, I'm sure there are, because composers, we are tough personalities sometimes. But like, yeah, yelling in a rehearsal, like making rude comments, even like talking bad about somebody like behind their back, or even, things like that, I think are definitely don'ts. And I've also been on the receiving end of that. Sometimes performers don't know I'm a composer, and I've heard them say things about like my piece, and I'm always like in my mind like, oh. So I think this goes for everybody. Just be kind to each other, and ultimately, my old teacher used to say, this is not brain surgery. Ultimately, we are just trying to do something together that's positive, and it should be like a great experience for everybody. So as much as we can do to be kind and create that kind of climate with each other, I think that's most important.
I remember this, but this didn't happen to me, but I remember not only hearing this, but hearing it from a lot of conductors, and a lot of administrators of a certain composer who was taken with all their expenses paid to a very fancy tour that gave the person a lot of visibility, and he didn't like the way that the conductor was doing the piece, so he never showed during the tour to the concerts to receive his bow. That I think that shows like not being interested in all the effort that is being put at the moment is so telling. And this story has, I've heard this story for a lot of people. It's like this composer is not played again during that orchestra, or not, and also a lot of orchestras, because they're like, well, if I'm going to put the effort rent, take them to tour to see them in the restaurant of the theater drinking because they hate the piece. The way that I'm conducting it is just sad. It's so everything that can show that you care about your piece will be met with kindness and an understanding, and then other people will be open to the change. But if you're like, oh, I hate it, and then you just don't show interest, it's just sad.
It sounds like at the end of the day, respect really is key in making sure that all interactions are as positive as possible.
Agreed.
Well, Nina, Lena, thank you for taking the time and taking the extra time. On a personal note, it's been quite an honor for me to dialogue with the both of you. Your work is so impactful and powerful in the field. Thank you for Nina, your creating the music that you create, and Lena, for your advocacy for the music that composers are creating. It's been a pleasure to dialogue with both of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Garrett, for inviting us. This is such an honor to talk with you.
Thanks so much, Garrett. This was really fun.
Thank you. And with that, I'll pass it off to Melissa. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you both so much for being our wonderful panelists today. Thank you to everyone who has joined us. We would again welcome your feedback on today's session, so please go ahead and use the link in the chat to complete our short survey. We would also love to welcome you back on March 1st at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time for Put Me On, Commissions and Consortia with Corey Field. And we'd like to offer another huge thanks to our Earshot partners, the American Composers Forum, New Music USA, and the League of American Orchestras. We are very grateful to the many individuals and organizations who have made Earshot possible through their support, and to ACO's artists, staff, and board for making this program a reality. For more information on Earshot, including how you can apply as a composer or connect with us to bring the program to your orchestra, as well as a full list of our supporters, visit us at americancomposers.org. Thank you so much again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.